Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be beginning a reading of a book that I am very excited about. This is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. The edition that I'm holding in my hand was published in 2000 from a translation of the work, which was originally in French, by Anthony Bonner in 1962. The illustrations in this edition are by the Dillons. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was originally published as a serial in a French newspaper in 1869 and 1870, and was then published as a novel in 1871. It's one of the early works of science fiction, though there are examples of fiction that could be considered to be part of the genre, dating all the way back to the 2nd century. It is one that has always been particularly fascinating to me. I love the work of Jules Verne. Around the World in 80 Days, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and this book were all very special to me. This copy was given to me by my parents in 2010 on the occasion of my birthday, and it makes me very happy to be able to share it with all of you. Jules Verne was a particularly interesting person due to his attention to detail in his writings. There is a lot of real science, or at least science as it was understood in the late 19th century, that goes into his works, and so that's one of the reasons why they really hold up to this day. They're also, as I hope you will agree as we begin the book, beautifully written, and this translation by Anthony Bonner is excellently done. So, with that preamble out of the way and my excitement at an all-time high, I want to begin this reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where we should begin with Chapter 1, A Shifting Reef. The year 1866 was marked by a strange event, an unexplainable occurrence which is undoubtedly still fresh in everyone's memory. Those living in coastal towns or in the interior of continents were aroused by all sorts of rumors, but it was seafaring people who were particularly excited. Merchants, shipowners, skippers and masters of Europe and America, naval officers of all countries, and the various governments of both continents were deeply concerned over the matter. Several ships had recently met at sea an enormous thing, a long, slender object which was sometimes phosphorescent, and which was infinitely larger and faster than a whale. The facts concerning this apparition, entered in various logbooks, agreed closely with one another as to the structure of the object or creature in question, the incredible speed of its movements, the surprising power of its locomotion, and the strange life with which it seemed endowed. If it was a member of the whale family, it was larger than any so far classified by scientists. Neither Cuvier, Lacépédie, Dumeril, nor Quatrefages would have admitted that such a monster could exist, unless they had seen it with their own scientists' eyes. taking an average of observations made at different times and rejecting those timid evaluations which said the object was only 200 feet long, and also putting aside those exaggerated opinions which said it was a mile wide and 3 miles long. One could nevertheless conclude that this phenomenal creature was considerably larger than anything at that time recognized by ichthyologists, if it existed at all. An ichthyologist, by the way, is someone who studies fish. Ichthos from the Greek. But it did exist. There was no denying this fact any longer, and considering the natural inclination of the human brain toward objects of wonder, one can understand the excitement produced throughout the world by this supernatural apparition. In any case, the idea of putting it into the realm of fiction had to be abandoned. On July 20th, 1866, the steamer Governor Higginson of the Calcutta and Burnack Steam Navigation Company had encountered this moving mass 5 miles east of the Australian coast. Captain Baker first thought he had sighted an unknown reef. He was even getting ready to plot its exact position when 2 columns of water spurted out of the inexplicable object and rose with a loud whistling noise to a height of 150 feet. So, unless the reef contained a geyser, the Governor Higginson was quite simply in the presence of an unknown aquatic mammal, spurting columns of water mixed with air and vapour out of its blowholes. A similar thing was observed on July 23rd of the same year in Pacific waters by the Christopher Columbus of the West India and Pacific Steam Navigation Company. This extraordinary creature could therefore move from one place to another with surprising speed, since within a space of only 3 days, the Governor Higginson and the Christopher Columbus had sighted it at 2 points on the globe separated by more than 2,100 nautical miles. 2 weeks later, and 6,000 miles from this last spot, the Helvetia of the Compagnie Nationale and the Shannon of the Royal Mail Steamship Company, passing on opposite courses in that part of the Atlantic lying between the United States and Europe, signalled one another that they had sighted the monster at 42 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 60 degrees 35 minutes west longitude. In this simultaneous observation, they felt able to judge the creature's minimum length at more than 350 feet, since it was larger than both ships, each of which measured 330 feet overall. But the largest whales, the Kulamak and Umgulik that live in the waters around the Aleutian Islands, never exceed 180 feet in length, if that much. These reports arrived one after the other, with fresh observations made on board the liner Le Perrier. A collision between the Etna of the Inman Line and the monster, an official report drawn up by the officers of the French frigate Normandy, and a very reliable sighting made by Commodore Fitz James's staff on board the Lord Clyde, greatly stirred public opinion. In light-hearted countries, people made jokes about it, but in serious, practical-minded countries, such as England, America, and Germany, it was a matter of grave concern. In every big city, the monster became the fashion. It was sung in cafes, derided in newspapers, and discussed on the stage. Scandal sheets had a marvellous opportunity to print all kinds of wild stories. Even extraordinary newspapers, always short of copy, printed articles about every huge imaginary monster one could think of, from the white whale, the terrible Moby Dick of the far north, to the legendary Norse kraken, whose tentacles could entwine a 500-ton ship and drag it to the bottom. Reports of ancient times were mentioned, the opinions of Aristotle and Pliny, who admitted to the existence of such monsters, along with those of the Norwegian bishop Pontoppidan, Paul Hegede, and finally Mr. Harrington, whose good faith no one can question when he claims to have seen, while on board the Castilian in 1857, that enormous serpent, which until then had been seen in no waters but those of the old Paris newspaper, the Constitutionnel. It was then that in scientific societies and journals an interminable argument broke out between those who believed in the monster and those who did not. The question of the monster had everyone aroused. Newspapermen, who always pretend to be on the side of scientists and against those who live by their imagination, spilled gallons of ink during this memorable campaign, and some even spilled 2 or 3 drops of blood after arguments that had started over sea serpents and ended in the most violent personal insults. For 6 months this war was waged with varying fortune. Serious, weighty articles were published by the Brazilian Geographical Institute, the Royal Scientific Academy of Berlin, the British Association, and the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. Others appeared in the Indian archipelago, in Abbe Munoz Cosmos, in Petermann's Mitteilungen, and in the science sections of all the important newspapers of France and other countries. The smaller newspapers replied with inexhaustible energy, their writers cleverly parodying a saying of Linnaeus, which had been quoted by the adversaries of the monster, stated that nature does not make fools. There's a note here. This is a pun on the 2 French words saut, jump or leap, as in the original saying of Linnaeus, and sot, fool, which are pronounced the same, although apparently not, if I say them. Apologies for my mispronunciations of the French. And called upon their contemporaries not to contradict nature by seriously discussing krakens, sea serpents, Moby Dicks, and other reports of delirious sailors. Finally, in a much-dreaded satirical newspaper, its favourite writer took care of the whole matter by attacking the monster, dealing it a death blow, and finishing it off in the midst of universal laughter. Wit had conquered science. During the first months of the year 1867, the whole question seemed buried, never to be revived, when new facts were brought before the public. It was no longer a question of a scientific problem to be solved, but of a real danger seriously to be avoided. The whole matter took on another aspect. The monster now became a small island, rock or reef, but a reef that was vague, shifting and intermediate. On March 5th, 1867, the Moravian of the Montreal Ocean Company, sailing at night at 27 degrees 30 minutes latitude and 72 degrees 15 minutes longitude, struck on its starboard side a rock indicated on no chart. It had been cruising at 13 knots under the combined force of the wind and its 400 horsepower engines. Had it not been for the superior quality of its hull, the Moravian undoubtedly would have been split open by the blow and sunk with the 237 passengers it was bringing back from Canada. The accident took place at about 5 in the morning, toward daybreak. The officers on watch rushed to the after part of the ship. They examined the sea carefully and saw nothing but an area of swirling water about 1/3 of the mile away, as if the surface had been violently agitated. Their position was noted, and the Moravian continued on its way, apparently without any serious damage. Had it struck a submerged rock, or the enormous wreck of some sunken ship? There was no way of knowing. But an inspection of its hull in dry dock showed that part of the keel had been broken. Even this, though extremely serious in itself, might perhaps have been forgotten, like so many other occurrences, if 3 weeks later it had not been reenacted under similar circumstances. But because of the nationality of the ship involved in this new collision, and the reputation of the company to which it belonged, this event caused a tremendous stir. There is no one who has not heard of the famous English shipowner Cunard. In 1840, this shrewd businessman started a postal service between Liverpool and Halifax with 3 wooden-sided wheel ships of 1,162 tons each, and equipped with engines capable of developing 400 horsepower. 8 years later, the company's fleet was increased by 4 ships of 1,820 tons each, and with 650 horsepower engines, and then 2 years after this, by 2 other vessels with yet greater tonnage and power. In 1853, the Cunard Line, whose mail-carrying privileges had just been renewed, successively added to its fleet the Arabia, the Persia, the China, the Scotia, the Java, and the Russia, all of them very fast, and larger than any ships which had ever plied the seas, except for the Great Eastern. Thus, in 1867, the company owned 12 ships, 8 with side wheels and 4 with propellers. If I give these brief details, it is so that everyone might know the importance of this ship company, known the world over for the intelligent way in which it is run. No transoceanic venture has been more cleverly organized, and none crowned with more success. In 26 years, Cunard ships have crossed the Atlantic 2,000 times without missing a single voyage, with never a delay, and without ever losing a single letter, man, or ship. This is why passengers, in spite of strong competition from French liners, still choose the Cunard Line in preference to all others, as would appear from a survey of official documents of the last few years. No one, therefore, will be surprised at the stir caused by an accident involving one of its finest steamers. On April 13th, 1867, the Scotia was sailing at 15 degrees 12 minutes longitude, and 15 degrees 37 minutes latitude, on a clear sea with a moderate breeze. It was travelling at a speed of 13.43 knots, propelled by its 1,000 horsepower engines. Its side wheels were striking the water in regular rhythm. It was drawing 22 feet of water with a displacement of 221,900 cubic feet. At 4:17 in the afternoon, while the passengers were gathered in the big lounge having their tea, a slight blow was felt against the hull of the Scotia, on the quarter slightly behind the port wheel. The Scotia had not struck something. It had been struck, and by some object which was more cutting or perforating than blunt. The blow had seemed so slight that nobody on board would have given it a second thought, had not the men working below rushed up onto the bridge and shouted, "We're sinking! We're sinking!" At first, the passengers were very frightened, but Captain Anderson quickly reassured them, for there was no real danger. The Scotia was divided into 7 watertight compartments, and therefore could face any leak with impunity. Captain Anderson immediately went down into the hold. He found the 5th compartment flooded, and the speed with which this had happened proved that the leak was considerable. Fortunately, this compartment did not contain the boilers, for then the fires would have gone out immediately. Captain Anderson ordered the engines stopped at once, and one of the sailors dove to find out the extent of the damage. He soon discovered that there was a hole 6 feet across in the hull of the steamer. But such a hole could not be plugged up, and so the Scotia had to continue its voyage with its side wheels half submerged. She was then 300 miles from Cape Clear, and finally, 3 days behind schedule, a delay which caused great uneasiness in Liverpool, she came alongside the company docks. After putting her in dry dock, engineers inspected the Scotia. They could not believe their eyes. 8 feet below her waterline, there was a neat hole in the form of an isosceles triangle. It was so perfectly shaped that it could scarcely have been done better with a precision instrument. The object which had made this hole must have been extremely unusual, and after being driven into the ship with prodigious force, enough to pierce a hull 1.5 inches thick, it must have withdrawn by itself in a manner completely unexplainable. This new event once again stirred up public opinion. From then on, all unexplained losses at sea were attributed to the monster. This fantastic animal bore the responsibility for all such shipwrecks, which unfortunately are not few in number. For of the 3,000 ships reported sunk each year by the Bureau Veritas, the number of steam or sailing ships assumed to be lost with all hands through absence of any news amounts to no less than 200. And it was the monster who, rightly or wrongly, was held responsible for their disappearance and for the increasing danger of travelling between various continents, to the point where the public came out with a categoric demand that the seas be rid of this formidable creature at any price. Chapter 2. The Pros and Cons. When these events took place, I was on my way back from a scientific expedition to the Badlands of Nebraska in the United States. The French government had asked me to join this expedition because of my position as assistant professor at the Museum of Natural History in Paris. After spending 6 months in Nebraska, I finally arrived in New York toward the end of March, laden down with the many precious things I had collected there. I was to leave for France in the beginning of May. In the meantime, I was busy classifying my mineralogical, botanical, and zoological treasures, be those mineral, vegetable, or animal. And it was then that the incident of the Scotia took place. I was well informed on this much discussed subject, and in fact, how could I not have been? I had read and reread all the American and European newspapers without getting any nearer to a conclusion. This mystery intrigued me. I was unable to form any opinion about it, and drifted from one extreme to the other. That something had actually taken place, there could be no question. Doubting Thomases were invited to touch the Scotia's wound. During my stay in New York, the question was at its height. The theory that it was a floating island or an elusive reef, upheld by people not competent to judge, had been completely abandoned. For unless this reef contained a motor, how could it move from one place to another with such prodigious speed? Likewise, the theory of the floating wreckage of some huge ship was rejected, also because of its rapidity of movement. There therefore remained only 2 possible solutions to the problem, and each one develops its own group of partisans. On the one hand, there were those who claimed it must be a monster of colossal strength, and on the other hand, there were those who held it to be a submarine with extremely powerful engines. But this second theory, perhaps the most plausible, could not stand up against the inquiries being carried out in both Europe and America. It seemed highly improbable that a private individual could have such a mechanical device at his disposition. How and when could he have built it? And how could he have kept its construction a secret? Only a government could possess a weapon of such destruction, and in these disastrous times when man's genius is being put to work increasingly, the power of weapons, some country might have tried to build such a formidable device. After the chasspot rifles, torpedoes. After the torpedoes, underwater battering rams. And then the reaction. At least, so I hope. But the theory that it was some war machine fell through before the statements of various governments. Since it was a matter of public interest, with the safety of transoceanic communications in question, there was no reason to doubt the honesty of their statements. And in addition, how could anyone imagine that the construction of such a submarine could have escaped public notice? To keep a secret under such circumstances is very difficult for any individual, and surely impossible for a country whose every act is constantly watched by powerful rivals. Therefore, after inquiries made in England, France, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Italy, America, and even Turkey, the theory of an underwater monitor was definitively rejected. So once again, and in spite of the incessant jokes in the lesser newspapers, everyone was talking about the monster, and people were soon inventing creatures more absurd than the wildest dreams of even some mad ichthyologist. During my stay in New York, several people had done me the honor of consulting me on this matter. In France, I had published a 2-volume work in quarto, called The Mysteries of the Ocean Depths. This book had been especially well received by scientists, and had therefore made me a specialist in this rather obscure branch of natural history. People wanted to know my opinion. As long as the facts could still be denied, I confined myself to complete skepticism. But I soon found myself driven into a corner and forced to explain in no uncertain terms. And finally, the Honorable Pierre Aronnax, professor of the Paris Museum, was called upon by the New York Herald to formulate some sort of opinion. I complied. I spoke because I could not remain silent. I discussed the problem from every angle, both political and scientific, and I give here an extract of my carefully written article, published in that newspaper on April 30th. After examining one by one all the various solutions that had been proposed, I said, "Therefore, since all other theories must be rejected, one is forced to admit the existence of some marine animal of extraordinary power. We know nothing about the great ocean depths. Soundings have been unable to reach them. What takes place in those remote canyons? What creatures live, or can live, 12 or 15 miles below the surface? How are such animals built? We can scarcely even guess. These questions go hand in hand with the problem under discussion, for either we know all the varieties of creatures which inhabit our planet, or we do not. If we do not know them all, if nature still holds some secrets for us where life in the sea is concerned, then nothing could be more reasonable than to admit the existence of fish or whales of a kind unknown to us, especially built to inhabit the unfathomable depths of the ocean, and which some event, whim, or desire brings to the surface at long intervals of time. If, on the contrary, we know all species of living things, we must try to find the animal in question among the marine creatures already classified, and in this case, I would favour admitting the existence of a giant narwhal. The ordinary narwhal, or unicorn fish, is a kind of whale which grows to a length of 60 feet. Multiply this by 5 or 10 times, give this fish strength in proportion to its size, and you will have the animal under discussion. It would have the proportions observed by the officers of the Shannon, the weapon required to explain the hole in the Scotia, and the strength needed to penetrate the hull of a steamer. For the narwhal is armed with a kind of ivory sword, or halberd, as some naturalists put it. It is a tusk, as hard as steel. Occasionally these tusks are found embedded in the bodies of other kinds of whales, against which the narwhal always wins. Others have been removed, not without difficulty, from the hulls of ships which they pierced clean through, as easily as a drill pierces a barrel. The museum in the Faculty of Medicine in Paris owns one of these tusks, 7 feet 4.5 inches long and 19 inches thick at the base. I find this difficult to believe. I have had the opportunity to see narwhal tusks in real life, and I can imagine one 7 feet long. The one I handled must have been about 6 feet, but 19 inches thick at the base is massive. In fact, they are technically conical, but the base is maybe 2 inches, 3 inches at the most. 14 would be massive. Now, imagine this weapon, as the professor has described, 10 times longer, and the fish 10 times stronger. Imagine it travelling at a speed of 20 miles an hour, multiplying this speed by its mass, and you will have a blow capable of producing the required catastrophe. Therefore, until I receive further information, I shall be of the opinion that it is a unicorn fish, of colossal proportions, armed not with a halberd, but with a real battering ram, like a warship, which it could equal in both size and strength. This might be the explanation of this unexplainable phenomenon, unless it is all an illusion, in spite of what has been glimpsed, seen, felt, and experienced, which is still possible. These last words were cowardice on my part, but to a certain degree I wanted to protect my scholarly reputation and not be the laughingstock of America, where people enjoy a hearty laugh. I left myself a way out, but in effect I admitted to the existence of the monster. My article was hotly discussed, and therefore became widely known. The solution it proposed, moreover, gave free rein to people's imaginations. The human mind enjoys grandiose ideas about supernatural creatures, and the sea is the proper medium for such ideas, for only there can giants arise and develop, giants alongside which earthly animals such as elephants or rhinoceros are nothing but dwarves. The seas support the largest known species of mammals, and they perhaps conceal mollusks of incredible size, or terrifying crustaceans such as lobsters 100 yards long, or crabs weighing 2 tons. Why not? Long ago, in geological times, earthbound animals, quadrupeds, quadrumana, reptiles, and birds all produced species of gigantic size. The Creator had formed them in a colossal mode, which time has reduced little by little. Why could the sea, with its unknown depths, not have kept some vast specimens of life in another age, since, unlike the earth's shell, which is being constantly altered, it is unchanging? Why could it not hide in its bosom the last survivors of titanic species, for whom years are centuries, and centuries millennia? but I'm letting myself be carried away by reveries which I must now put aside. But back then, people had already made up their minds about this matter, and the public wholeheartedly believed in the existence of some prodigious creature which had nothing in common with fabled sea serpents. But although some people saw it as a purely scientific problem, others, especially the more practical-minded people in America and England, thought it best to clear the ocean of this terrible monster in order to make transatlantic travel safe again. Industrial and commercial newspapers considered the question principally from this point of view. The Shipping and Mercantile Gazette, the Lloyd, the Paquebot, the Revue Maritime et Coloniale, and all the periodicals concerned with insurance companies who threatened to raise their rates were unanimous on this point. Once public opinion had made itself felt, the United States was the first country to go into action. A very fast frigate, the Abraham Lincoln, got ready to put to sea as soon as possible. The shipyards were thrown open to Commander Farragut, who had his ship fitted out with great speed and efficiency. But then, as always happens, just when it had been decided to chase the monster, it did not reappear. For 2 months it was not heard of. No ship sighted it. It seemed as if this unicorn fish knew about the plots being hatched against it. There had been so much discussion about it, and even over the transatlantic cable. Some jokers pretended that this sly creature had intercepted some telegram and was making use of the information it contained. The frigate was therefore prepared for a long campaign and equipped with formidable fishing gear. But no one knew where to send it, and everyone was growing more impatient when, on July the 2nd, it was learned that a steamer of the line that plies between San Francisco and Shanghai had seen the animal 3 weeks earlier in northern Pacific waters. This piece of news caused great excitement. Commander Farragut was ordered to set sail within 24 hours. The ship was stocked with food and its coal bunkers filled to the brim. Not a single man was missing for the ship's roll call. All that remained to be done was to light its furnaces, heat its boilers, and weigh anchor. Another half-day's delay would have been unforgivable. But then, Commander Farragut asked nothing better than to be underway. 3 hours before the Abraham Lincoln was due to leave its pier in Brooklyn, I received the following letter. Monsieur Aronnax, Professor of the Paris Museum, Fifth Avenue Hotel, New York. Dear Sir, if you would like to join the expedition of the Abraham Lincoln, the government of the Union will take great pleasure in having you represent France on this enterprise. Commander Farragut has a cabin at your disposal. Very cordially yours, J.B. Hobson, Secretary of the Navy. Chapter 3. As Monsieur wishes. 3 seconds before the arrival of J.B. Hobson's letter, I had no more thought about chasing the unicorn fish than I had about trying to find the northwest passage. 3 seconds after reading a letter from the Honourable Secretary of the Navy, I realized that that was my true vocation. My sole aspiration was to chase this disturbing monster and rid the world of it. But I had just come back from a long trip. I was tired and longing for rest. I had only one desire: to return to my country, my friends, my little apartment near the botanical gardens, and my precious collections. But nothing could keep me back. I forgot everything: weariness, friends, and collections, and without a second thought, I accepted the American government's offer. Besides, I thought, all roads lead back to Europe, and maybe the unicorn fish will be kind enough to lure me toward the coasts of France. this worthy animal will let himself be caught in European waters as a personal favour to me, and then I'll bring back no less than 1.5 feet of his ivory tusk for the Museum of Natural History. But in the meantime, we had to look for this narwhal in the North Pacific, which meant going to France by way of the Antipodes. Conseil, I cried impatiently. Conseil was my servant, a devoted young man who followed me on all my trips, a brave Belgian whom I liked and who liked me. He was impassive by nature, of regular habits as a matter of principle, eager out of habit, scarcely ever taken aback by life's surprises, very clever with his hands, fit for any kind of service, and the sort of person who, in spite of having a name meaning advice, never gave any, even when asked. As a result of rubbing elbows with the little group of scientists attached to the botanical gardens, Conseil had picked up quite a bit of knowledge. In him I had a well-informed specialist in natural history classification, who could, with an acrobat's ease, rush up and down the ladder of phyla, divisions, classes and subclasses, orders, families, genera, subgenera, species, and varieties. But his knowledge ended there. His whole life was classification, and he knew nothing else. He was very well read in the theory of classification, but knew little about the practical side, to the point where I don't think he could have told the difference between a sperm whale and an ordinary whale. But in spite of this, he was a fine young man. For 10 years now, Conseil had followed me everywhere science had led me. Never a murmur about the length or weariness of a trip, never an objection to packing his suitcase for some new country, China or the Congo, no matter how far off it was. He would go anywhere, without question. Moreover, his strong constitution defied all illness. He had powerful muscles, but no nerves, or at least he gave the appearance of not having any. He was 30, and his age was to his masters as 15 is to 20. Please excuse me for thus stating that I was 40 years old. But Conseil had one defect. Being of a very formal nature, he only addressed me in the third person, to the point where it was annoying. Conseil, I repeated, as feverishly I began my preparations for leaving. I felt completely sure of this young man's devotion. I usually never asked him whether or not he would like to accompany me on my travels, but this time it was a question of an expedition that could go on indefinitely, of a dangerous enterprise in pursuit of an animal capable of sinking a frigate as if it were a nutshell. This was food for thought, even for the most impassive man in the world. What would he say? Conseil! I shouted a third time. Conseil appeared. Monsieur was calling? He said as he entered. Yes, my boy. Get our things together, mine and yours. We're leaving in 2 hours. As monsieur wishes. Conseil answered calmly. There's not a moment to lose. Pack all my travelling equipment and as many suits, shirts, and socks as you can, and hurry. And monsieur's collection? We'll take care of that later. What? The Archaeotherium, Hydrocotherium, Creodons, Cheloptomus, and the other specimens monsieur collected. They'll keep them for us at the hotel. And monsieur's live Barbarossa? They'll feed it while we're away. Besides, I'll have our menagerie sent to France after we leave. That means we're not going back to Paris? Conseil asked. Yes, don't worry, I answered evasively, only by a rather roundabout way. Whatever roundabout way Monsieur wishes. Oh, it won't be too long, just not quite as direct, that's all. We're taking passage on the Abraham Lincoln. Whatever suits Monsieur, replied Conseil calmly. You know, my friend, that it has to do with the monster, the famous narwhal. We're going to rid the seas of this animal. The author of a 2-volume work in quarto on the mysteries of the ocean depths cannot turn down an invitation to go with Commander Farragut. It's a glorious mission, but also dangerous. No one knows where it will take us. These creatures can be full of strange whims, but we'll go all the same. We have a commander who will stop at nothing. Wherever Monsieur goes, I'll go too, answered Conseil. But think it over. I want to be completely frank with you. People don't always come back from the expeditions such as these. As Monsieur wishes. A quarter of an hour later, our trunks were ready. Conseil had done everything in the twinkling of an eye, and I could be sure nothing was missing, for he classified shirts and suits just as carefully as he did birds and mammals. The elevator left us in the big mezzanine lounge. I went down the stairs leading to the lobby. I paid my bill at the huge reception desk, which was always crowded with people. I left orders to have my cases of stuffed animals and dried plants sent to Paris. I opened an account large enough to take care of the Barbarossa, and with Conseil right behind, jumped into a carriage. This cab, which charged $4 for the trip, went down Broadway to Union Square, followed 4th Avenue to its junction with the Bowery, then took Catherine Street and stopped at Pier 34. There, the Catherine ferry took everything, men, horses, and carriage, to Brooklyn, that great annex of New York situated on the other side of the East River, and in several minutes we arrived on the wharf, alongside which the Abraham Lincoln was belching forth columns of smoke through its 2 funnels. Our baggage was immediately transferred to the deck of the frigate. I rushed aboard and asked for Commander Farragut. One of the sailors led me to the poop, where I found myself in the presence of a handsome officer who stretched out his hand to me. "Mr. Prieur Aronnax," he said. "Yes," I answered. "Commander Farragut?" "In person. Welcome aboard, Professor. Your cabin is ready." I bowed, and leaving the commander to take care of his preparations, I had taken myself to my cabin. The Abraham Lincoln had been perfectly chosen and fitted out for its new task. It was a very fast frigate, with superheating equipment. Without permitting it to build up as much as with superheating equipment permitting it to build up as much as 7 atmospheres of steam pressure. Under these conditions, the Abraham Lincoln could attain a speed of 18.3 knots, which, although considerable, was nevertheless not enough to grapple with the gigantic creature we were after. The way it was fitted out inside corresponded favourably with its nautical qualities. I was very pleased with my cabin, which had a door leading to the officers' mess. "We'll be very comfortable here," I said to Conseil. "If Monsieur doesn't mind me saying so," answered Conseil, "as comfortable as a hermit crab in the shell of a whelk." I left Conseil to secure our trunks, and went back on deck to watch the preparations for departure. Just then, Commander Farragut was ordering to cast off the last rope mooring the Abraham Lincoln to its Brooklyn pier. That meant that if I had been a quarter of an hour late, or even less, the frigate would have left without me, and I would have missed out on this extraordinary, strange, and improbable expedition, a true account of which might well meet with some skepticism. but Commander Farragut did not want to lose a single moment setting out for those waters where the animal had been sighted. He called for his engineer. "Is the pressure up?" he asked. "Yes, sir," answered the engineer. "Go ahead," cried Commander Farragut. At this order, transmitted to the engine room by means of a compressed air device, the mechanics put the starting wheel into motion. The steam whistled through the half-open valves. The long horizontal pistons groaned and pushed the rods and drive shaft. The blades of the propeller struck the water with increasing speed, and the Abraham Lincoln pushed forward amid an escort of 100 ferryboats and tenders filled with spectators. The Brooklyn and Manhattan wharves lining the East River were filled with people. 3 hurrahs, rising from 500,000 chests, burst out one after the other. Thousands of handkerchiefs waved above the compact mass of the crowd, saluting the Abraham Lincoln till it reached the waters of the Hudson, at the tip of that elongated peninsula which contains the city of New York. Then the frigate followed the New Jersey shore, lined with villas, and passed by the forts which saluted it with their largest cannon. The Abraham Lincoln answered by 3 times lowering and raising the American flag, whose 39 stars shone on the mizzenmast. Then, slowing down in order to pass through the channel marked by buoys, it passed Sandy Hook, where thousands of spectators cheered it once again. The escort of boats and tenders did not leave the frigate until she reached the lightship whose 2 beacons mark the entrance to New York harbor. It was then 3 o'clock. The pilot got into his dinghy and rowed over to the little schooner waiting for him to leeward. The fires were stoked up, and the propeller churned faster in the water. The frigate skirted the long, yellow coast of Long Island, and at 8 in the evening, after losing sight of Fire Island to the northwest, it ran, full steam, toward the dark waters of the Atlantic. And that, my friends, is where we will leave ourselves today. There is so much more to be said in this exciting adventure. I hope these first few chapters have piqued your interest, just as I feel the love of this story welling up again in my heart. I'm so looking forward to sharing with you the rest of this marvelous Jules Verne novel. I look forward to seeing you again soon to continue our journey beneath the waves. But until that time, I must bid you all adieu. And until next we meet, I wish you all the best and goodbye.